All right, now that we've discussed Buddhism in the Kamakura period, I would also like to discuss literature during the Kamakura period. One of them is called, probably the most famous piece of Kamakura shogunate literature is called the Hojoki, or in English, An Account of My Hut. It was written by someone named Kamo no Chome. He was a former Kyoto aristocrat, and he later became a Buddhist priest. So when he became a priest, he escapes. He retreats to a very small hut in the woods. So he writes the Hojoki. He lives in a small hut, and so he's talking about life in his hut. So it's a very, very Buddhist text because it talks about abandoning the world, abandoning his life as an aristocrat in Kyoto, and retreating to a life of living by himself in the woods. So a lot of Kamakura literature is based on Buddhist themes because of this flowering of Buddhism during the Kamakura period, and basically talking about impermanence, right? Things come and go, but you really have yourself at the end of the day. And so that's kind of what the Hojoki talks about. Another very interesting book written during the Kamakura period is The Tale of the Heike. So even though it was a book, it was often recited orally by blind musicians who would go from province to province and tell this story through oral tradition. And basically, this is the Tale of the Heike is what we did in chapter 4. Okay, it's the story of the Taira clan, how they had everything and they lost it. Okay, so just like the other texts in the Kamakura period, it's a very heavily Buddhist book document because it criticizes the Taira for being too concerned with worldly pleasures and for having no spirituality. They had nothing, they were empty inside, soulless, because they just believed in materialistic things and power. And because they had nothing like that, look what happened to them. They had an awful fate. And so it teaches people that everything comes and goes. If you don't have anything spiritually, you're empty, because materialistic things can disappear one day to the next. And so the Tale of the Heike is a lesson to people to forget the pleasures of the world and to focus on what is within, right? So your spirituality. So this is also a very heavily Buddhist text. You probably remember the Kokinshu from the Heian period. Well, 300 years later, the new Kokinshu is written by aristocrats in 1205, and this is another anthology of waka. You can think of it as a sequel to the Kokinshu, but the difference between the two is the Kokinshu was not as heavily of a Buddhist document. The new Kokinshu was very, very heavily Buddhist in its themes, more melancholy. You know, the country just had several civil wars in 30 years. And this was a way of the Japanese aristocrats reflecting on the sadness and the impermanence of their world. So much had changed in the last century. So two main contributors are the monk Saigyo and Fujiwara no Teika. There were two aristocrats who contributed to this new Kokinshu. And some major themes are yugen, which is a sense of mystery in the poems, and yojo, subtle double meaning to the poetry. Very melancholy Buddhist poetry. So all three main texts of the Kamakura period have Buddhism in common. Very heavily Buddhist in their outlook. And remember that Todaiji Temple was burned during the Genpei War. Many other temples were damaged as well. What Shogun Yoritomo does right after he commences the Kamakura shogunate is he begins a fundraiser drive across the country to rebuild the Buddhist temples, including Todaiji, and redecorate them with new sculptures. So other Nara temples that had been damaged as well, in addition to Todaiji, were rebuilt. This is called the Nara Renaissance, because Nara hadn't really been touched ever since the capital was moved to Kyoto in 794. But now Yoritomo starts rebuilding it, and there's a sort of renaissance of new architecture, Buddhist architecture in Nara for the first time. And Yoritomo hires a sculptor known as Unke. He's known as the samurai sculptor, and he was responsible for constructing new pieces of Buddhist sculpture all over Japan, namely in Nara. Okay, and for example, the guardian deities outside of Todaiji Temple are Unke's work. Okay, so interestingly enough, though, after Unke, religious sculpture declines in Japan. And the reason for this is the new Buddhist sects we talked about, Pure Land, True Pure Land, Nichiren, Zen, they were not as fond of iconography and Buddhist sculpture as Tendai and Shingon were. Okay, so turning Buddhist deities into art or sculpture was frowned upon by the new sects of Buddhism. And so because artists were not allowed, under these new forms of Buddhism, to paint or sculpt religious figures, what are they going to do? Who are they going to sculpt? Or draw, or paint? They have nothing to do, right? So artists now, for the first time in Japan, begin to draw portraits of historical figures. Emperors, shoguns, Hojo regents. And this is the first time because before the Kamakura period, this had never been done. Art was basically limited to Buddhist figures, gods, deities. But because the new forms of Buddhism frown on this, the new artists begin to actually draw historical figures starting with the Kamakura period. Okay?